On this day, the 14th of December, 1918, the British general election takes place. This election was probably one of the most transformative and long-lasting of any election that has taken place in all of history. It was the first election in which all men over the age of 21 had the right to vote. It was the first election in which all women above the age of 30 had the vote. It was the first election in which women could stand for Parliament. This election marked the rise of the Labour Party, the destruction of the Liberal Party, the consolidation of Conservative rule in the United Kingdom, and the eventual separation of Ireland from the United Kingdom. It was a very eventful time. On the 11th of November, Germany signed an armistice with the Allies in France. Already, the Rhineland had been occupied by the Allies. Germans had had their revolution, had overthrown their emperor and their various smaller kings. The world had changed. Austria was gone. Russia was gone. The Ottoman Empire was gone. All over the world, chaos reigned. No one knew what the borders were anymore. They didn't know where Germany began and Poland ended. They didn't know if Russia was even going to exist. Down in the Middle East and Turkey, again, where were the borders? Who knows? There were mass movements of people. There were civil wars. There were refugees. There were genocides. There were little pockets of villages and towns that were pretty much running themselves, with petty lords and kings calling themselves everything from anarchists to Mensheviks, Bolsheviks, Young Turks, Armenian nationalists, Zionists. Who knows what was going on? It was chaos out there. Back home, things were a bit less chaotic, but in Ireland things were pretty unstable. After the 1916 Rising in Ireland, there had been some problems, missteps by the government in terms of how they dealt with the aftermath of the 1916 Rising. It was initially not terribly popular, but the British government, in responding to the 1916 uprising, caused a lot of resentment. Ireland was supposed to be getting home rule at the end of this war. But after 1916, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, rushed through another Home Rule Bill. This Home Rule Bill would give Ireland two parliaments, one in the north and one in the south. There would be a Northern Ireland Assembly and a Southern Ireland Assembly. And there would be one overarching All-Ireland Committee that would eventually lead to the unification of Ireland and both parliaments being united. That was the idea, but things weren't going to work out as was planned. So, the end of the war, Lloyd George probably at the zenith of his power. He had split the Liberal Party between himself and Herbert Asquith, and Lloyd George's vanity probably, and Herbert Asquith's, neither of them were willing to step back or step down. Both of them together helped destroy the Liberal Party for good. Between them, they got quite a few votes, but because they were standing against each other, many Liberals, dozens, lost seats to Labour that they could have won. The Labour Party, with all these new voters, surged ahead in terms of votes and seats. It now became apparent that Labour was a rising power, rising threat to the establishment. So, what were the results of this extraordinary election? Well, the Conservatives, as part of the coalition government, got 379 seats. Lloyd George's coalition Liberals got 127 seats. Sinn Féin, under Eamon de Valera, got 73 seats. The Labour Party, 57. Herbert Asquith's Liberals, 36. And the Irish Parliamentary Party, only 7. Now, this was very different. Back in 1910, the Irish Parliamentary Party got 74. Herbert Asquith's Liberals, so the original Liberals, had got 272 back in 1910. Labour Party, they only won about 10 more seats, but share of the vote had gone up big time. And the Conservatives, well, they did very well. They went up from 271 seats, so they almost doubled. So, the seats were very different. But the whole situation in Britain was very different now. So, what happened with Asquith and with Bonar Law, the Conservative leader, was that they would vouch or endorse a candidate if they were going to be part of the coalition government. This is how Lloyd George got into power. And from what I can see, it's almost as if Lloyd George was trying to create some sort of new system, almost. He wanted to replace political parties with basically him as just in charge. He wanted the Conservatives, and he had most of them on side. He wanted the Liberals, and he had about half of them on side, although he had more seats in the end. He wanted Labour as well. He had even had a few Labour coalition members. And even an independent coalition member. But this was going to be his great undoing, because he was in coalition government as the Prime Minister, head of government, but his Liberals behind him were only about half the size of the Conservatives, who could very easily have ruled on their own, and would eventually do. 1922, there was a crisis within the government because of Lloyd George's corruption and his vanity, and the Conservatives decided to dump the coalition, and they then went on to rule by themselves. There's a committee in the Conservative Party called the 1922 Committee, and the name celebrates the fact that the backbenchers broke this coalition government. And it has been, since then, the most powerful committee for backbenchers within the Conservative Party. Conservative Prime Ministers and Ministers are always afraid when the 1922 Committee starts complaining. Now, getting back to this. So we had a very different outcome from 1910, and one of the places, as I said, Ireland, had a landslide for Sinn Féin. If you look at the votes, Sinn Féin didn't actually get a majority of the votes within Ireland. They might have got a majority of the votes within the present 26 counties, but overall, the Unionist parties and the Home Rule Party got about 53 to 54% of the vote. So if there had been proportional representation at that point, Sinn Féin would not have been as powerful back then, and perhaps would not have been able to force an independent Ireland. Even if they had decided to have a referendum, it could have had an interesting outcome. But because of first past the post, Sinn Féin got the majority of the seats, if not the votes. This would lead to the establishment of Dáil Éireann and to the Irish War of Independence, which would lead to the Irish Free State, the Civil War, and then Ireland's isolation over the next few decades. But many in Britain were, at the time, 1921-22, they were quite happy with that. They felt that they had solved the Irish question, and they no longer had to spend parliamentary time, speeches, effort on having to deal with the problems in Ireland. And so for a time, they were quite happy, although it did come back to life back in the 60s. But for then, it was sorted. The rise of Labour was another huge thing. Within only a few years, Labour would be in government. This is a party that wasn't even founded until 1900, and wasn't even considered a serious party until 1918. 4 years later, they're going to be in government. Now, that is the story of the general election on the 14th of December 1918. A transformative election, one in which we see political parties rise and fall, one in which we see a new country being born on this day. If you like these videos, come back for more tomorrow. Like, subscribe, and comment.